Hi, so today we're going to look at two different types of dry food. We're going to compare cold pressed food and extruded food because there's a lot of information on the internet that says cold pressed food is better for dogs' health or it's more digestible, and I really just want to investigate the research and the science behind this to see if it's true, because actually a lot more dogs eat extruded food than cold pressed food. So let's look at this and see what you decide at the end. So first of all, let's look at how they're both made. So cold pressed food, first of all, you take the ingredients, they are dried and ground. Now this sometimes involves some pre-cooking of the ingredients. So for example, cereals would be pre-cooked, as this helps with starch gelatinization, it helps to aid digestibility. And meat or fish might be pre-cooked because it will kill the pathogens such as bacteria. And some pet foods that use cold pressed food actually pre-cook all the ingredients. So just because it says cold pressed doesn't mean it's not actually cooked. Now I couldn't actually find any information about the length of time these ingredients are pre-cooked for before they're mixed together, or the temperatures they're cooked at. So you might need to ask individual manufacturers if you want to know that, but it's just worth noting that there is a cooking process going on here. So once these ingredients are dried and ground, they're mixed with water, and then they're put into a machine to actually press them into a pellet. And once they are going through that pressing stage, it actually creates friction, and that creates heat naturally, so up to about 80 degrees centigrade. So there is some heat during the pressing process as well. But that produces a pellet at the end of it, and that's how cold pressed food is made. There's no steam involved in cold pressed food. So on the other hand, extruded food, you start with the same sort of basics. So you've got your dried ground ingredients, and then you mix that with your liquids, so your water or your freshly prepared meat or fish, which are in a liquid state. But you also use steam as well. So those are all mixed together in a machine called a preconditioner, and that creates like a sort of dough basically. Now the next stage is that this dough goes into an extruder, where the mixture is cooked under pressure and quite high temperatures. So the temperature would be reaching an average of 130 degrees centigrade, but it would only be cooked at that for a very short period of time, somewhere between 1 minute and 4.5 minutes typically, so quite a small amount of time. The next stage then is that you've got this cooked dough, and it actually gets pushed out of the extruder via something called a die plate. So it's a big silver plate, which has lots of little holes in it, and the holes are the shape of the kibble that you want your food to be. So for example, if you know that there's a kibble that's oval shape or bone shaped or a fish shaped one, the food is pushed through that, creating like sort of doughy ribbons. So if you have ever had a sort of machine when you were a child and you had sort of dough, plasticine type stuff, and you pushed it through holes and then you get that sort of ribbon shape, that's what you're getting at this point. So you then get a rotary cutter that spins around and it cuts off the size, these ribbons, so you get the small kibble shapes. But at this stage they're still really hot and they're still quite moist and squishy, so we need to dry them. So they go into an oven for the moisture to be removed. And typically then, once they've been dried, they will have some palatability enhancer added to the outside of the kibble. So that can either be fat sometimes, so your oils or your fats, and sometimes it's something called a digest, which people tend to really worry about. But another name for digest would be a stock or a gravy. Sometimes you see it as hydrolyzed livers, and they all mean the same thing, and they're just there to basically make the food nice and tasty for your pets. So that would be the case with extruded food. So as you can see, or as you can hear, the temperature that the cold pressed food is pressed at is a lot lower than the temperature that extruded food is cooked at. And so it's all sort of, it's thought that this high temperature kills a lot of the nutrients, and therefore dogs are much better on a cold pressed food because they're getting more of the natural nutrients, vitamins and minerals. However, When you're making an extruded food, you add in extra vitamins and minerals at the start of the process to account for any nutrient losses that may occur during cooking. So the dog will get everything it needs when it eats a complete food. That's what the word complete means. So you would add extra to compensate for that. Now, whether having it in a more natural form and cooked at a lower temperature makes this food better for the health of dogs, we actually just don't know that yet. There's not enough information. But that's how the two different foods differ from each other. So, let's go on to digestibility of cold pressed versus extruded foods. And this is where you might have seen the experiment, and if you haven't, you can Google it. It's on Google Images. 2 glasses of water, one has a cold pressed food in it and one has an extruded food in it. Now the cold pressed food has sunk to the bottom of the first glass and is already breaking up, whereas the extruded food is floating on the surface of the water and will gradually soak up the water and sink. But the information given with this picture, this sort of image, is that the cold pressed food must be more digestible because it's already breaking up and it's sunk to the bottom of the water, and therefore it's much better for our dogs. But there's quite a few issues with this, and I'm just going to run through a few of them. So the first thing is that obviously these are glasses of water and the dog's stomach has a completely different environment. So for example, the pH is slightly acidic, so it's going to be very different to water. The temperature of the dog's stomach will make a difference while the food is being processed. Internal temperature of dogs is 101 Fahrenheit plus. Obviously it differs between individuals, but it is really high temperature, so that's going to make a difference. We've got your digestive enzymes being released into the stomach and gastric juices to help break down the food. And you've also got the mechanical churning of the stomach as well, which is helping to break it down. And once the food actually leaves the stomach and goes into the intestines, you've then got all the bacteria flora, so your bacteria, your other good things like your protozoas, your fungi, that type of thing, and they're all helping with digestion and absorption of food, which you don't have in those glasses of water. So it's not a reliable way to gauge how digestible a food is. So I actually also had a look for some scientific papers and journals that are compared digestibility of cold pressed food and extruded food, and I have only been able to find 2 papers over the last however many years, like decades basically. So there is really very little evidence for or against either of these foods. So the first paper I found was from 1996. It only looked at 6 dogs, so it's really, you probably can't take a lot away from it anyway. However, this paper did find that the protein digestibility was higher in cold pressed foods, but the fat digestibility wasn't different between cold pressed or extruded, so there was no difference between those. So that one did suggest that there was a benefit to cold pressed food, but as I said, it was only 6 dogs. The more recent study was from 2018, so a little bit more recent. Unfortunately, that only looked at 30 dogs, so not much bigger, and not a bigger sample size. Now that one contradicted the first study. It found that not only did dogs prefer the extruded food when given the choice, they found that the dry matter and protein digestibility of the foods were higher on the extruded diet than the cold pressed diet. And these are exactly the same recipes, by the way, just processed, cooked differently. And they did actually find that the dogs had slightly looser stools on the cold pressed food, which suggests a slightly poorer digestibility as well. So when it comes to scientific evidence of whether cold pressed is better than extruded food, there actually isn't any at the moment. So as I've probably said in a previous video, it's a really good idea just to judge it for yourself. If you're feeding a food to your dog, the way to tell if they're digesting it properly is by the amount of poo they're producing and how solid it is, basically. So if your dog should be going ideally once or twice a day to the toilet to produce a stool, it should be easy to pick up, or kickable as we used to say. And and not loose or runny, or starting off solid and getting runnier, because that suggests they're not digesting their food as well as they should be. And if those things you know, are normal, and you're not having to feed huge volumes of food for your dog to maintain its weight and produce normal stools, then the food you're feeding is suiting it and it is digestible. So that's a really important fact. So I hope this has been helpful. I know it's a bit longer than the usual videos, but there was a lot to cram in. Feel free to ask any questions and I will try to answer them. Thank you.